In this episode, we talk about how nearly 80 years after one of the darkest chapters in pre-partition India, a new film has reignited debate over one of its figures, Gopal Mukherjee. We also talk about the Supreme Court directing 5 comedians, including Samay Raina, to issue an unconditional apology over their remarks regarding people with disabilities. But first, we take a look at US President Donald Trump and his tariff regime, which has become the most consequential economic policy of his second term. Hi, I'm Ichha Sharma, and you're listening to 3 Things, the Indian Express news show.
China, 67%. European Union, 39%. Vietnam, 90%. Taiwan, 64%. We're going to charge them 32%. Japan, 46%. They would charge us 46%. India, very, very tough. Very, very tough. They charge us 52%.
Even people that were against tariffs only because they didn't understand tariffs, they didn't even know what a tariff was. You had economists that didn't even know what a tariff was. They're all my biggest fan now.
By the way, the stock market went up 1,000 points. That was as of 10 minutes ago. I can't tell you what happened. A lot of things happened. But the stock market's up almost 1,000 points.
Now, Trump, along with his cabinet members and economic advisors, has repeatedly insisted that these tariffs would boost the American economy and give the US leverage for better trade deals. And this is despite the fact that economists around the world have been arguing that these tariffs would be harmful not only to the US but also to the global economy. So the question is, how much has the US economy actually been affected by these tariffs since Trump announced them nearly 5 months ago? To answer this, my colleague Shashank Bhargava speaks to the Indian Express's Udit Misra, who writes on the economy for the paper.
Udit, maybe we can begin by just talking about the meaning of tariffs, which is basically a tax imposed by a government on goods imported from outside the country. So let's say a car is being imported from the US, the Indian government can then, for example, put tariffs on it by taxing it. So people buying that car here will have to pay more for it. And this way, the government gets something, and also the Indian car companies get a competitive advantage because their cars would then become more affordable for the Indian consumers as compared to the US cars.
Yeah, Shashank. So this is essentially an important point to note that tariffs are typically justified on grounds of helping the domestic producers, the domestic manufacturers or domestic producers of any kind. And yes, it is true that in the initial phase of any tariff that is applied, it appears to give your domestic producers a boost, right? Because suppose the Indian car is 100 rupees and the American car is 90 rupees. Now you slap a massive 50% tariff on the American car, the Indian car becomes immediately more affordable. And for a brief period, it would look like the Indian producers would get better off, in selling the car. But one of the ironies of tariff is that very soon the Indian producers will realize that they don't have to keep it at 100. They can increase the price without necessarily making their car better and keep it just a shade lower than whatever the American price plus tariff is. And so the worse off is the consumer. And this is universally true about tariffs, that they are worse off for everybody. Then nobody really gains from tariffs. And the consumers will not be getting the car of their choice, any enhanced efficiency because of higher prices they pay. And just some domestic producers will be better off at the expense of, savings and efficiencies across the board.
Right. And this is, of course, not something that US President Donald Trump and his cabinet ministers are saying. In fact, they're claiming the exact opposite. But, when talking about just how much these tariffs have impacted the US, I imagine that would be a hard thing to judge, right? Because these tariffs, one, haven't been standard. And also Trump himself has been going back and forth, right? He's been putting them into effect. He's been pausing them. He's been increasing them, then lowering them. So how should one go about judging their impact?
Yes, so the start and stop nature of President Donald Trump's announcements on tariff is a very crucial bit because he's taking these decisions as executive orders and not through legislative changes. He can do this, that he can raise tariffs today and then pause them tomorrow or bring them down the third day. And what is happening as a result of that is that while we hear a lot of big numbers, 50% here, 100% there, in effect, the numbers are lower than the announced numbers, because we hear 100, then we hear a rollback of 25% and this. So the effective number then comes down. And also the fact that as consumers realize that tariffs are coming, they were already buying a lot of stuff. So a lot of goods were pre-bought, they sort of were advanced. Those sales were advanced. And so to some extent, the whole effect of tariff has not yet taken place in prices. Because, you were supposed to buy a car, later in the year, and then you advanced it by 3-4 months. So now maybe the car is costlier, but you've already bought it and you bought it at a lower price. So the inflationary aspect doesn't show up. For example, as against the 50 or 100% numbers that we often sort of associate with President Trump's tariff, the effective announced rate is only 18.6%. Now, this is not a small number. It is much higher than the 2.5% tariffs that US had. But the actual number on which can be calculated by how many people have actually bought things at that price, that effective tariff comes out to only 9%. So half of what is announced. So between 2.5 to 9, yes, it is a massive jump, 3 times jump. But 9 is only half of what is actually announced and is in suspension. And that 18 can actually go up to 36 or whatever, depending on where the negotiations land. And this is precisely the reason why the exact impact of these tariffs is difficult to gauge on the US economy. However, having said that, there is no doubt that if you look at the data carefully, you will find that the US economy is worse off as a result of these tariffs.
Okay, so when it comes to inflation, I guess we'll know in the coming few months how much people will be impacted there, because like you mentioned, a lot of tariff-related goods people bought in advance, before the tariffs kicked in. So we'll know the inflationary impact in the future. But the other thing that even Donald Trump has been talking about is that the US stock market has been doing great. NASDAQ, which tracks the top 100 companies in the US, it has been performing really well. So how is it that that's happening? How come those benchmark indices have been doing well despite these tariffs?
Yeah, so the first thing is that even on inflation, the inflation numbers are going up, and they may not be going up as fast as or as severely as others imagined initially. Although by the end of this month, we'll get more data which might point to higher inflation. Since April, inflation has been trending upwards in US, and which is a big cause of concern. It may not have trended as high as many imagined initially. Now, when we come to the markets, this is one of the, regular problems that we see in a lot of people, whether it is in India or elsewhere, where people look at the market number, stock indices, and say that the economy must be doing well if the market is doing well. But this is a common mistake and should not be really used. Any index that is used is essentially the index of those companies. Now, in an economy, for example, like India, the Sensex 30, the 30 companies can be doing very well, while the broader economy may not be doing that well, because the Sensex is only mapping the fortunes of the top 30 companies. And I looked at this data for US, and the story unravels very quickly. So NASDAQ 100 is typically a good metric that people saying that nothing has impacted US is used. NASDAQ 100 is the top 100 non-financial companies, and essentially is dominated by some of the biggest tech firms, the Apples and Nvidias and Google and Facebook. Now, I looked at the data from the start of the year to now. NASDAQ 100 has gone up by more than 10.6%, right? And a lot of people would say this is a great number, and it essentially is. But if you start looking at other metrics, other indices, then the story starts unraveling. For example, S&P 500 is their broader index, which is 500 top companies. That has grown over the same period by only 8.7%. So distinctly 2 percentage points slower. Then you look at the Dow Jones Industrial Averages, which is one of the oldest stock index in US. It has grown by only 5.6%, so almost half that NASDAQ number. Then if you go to the Russell 2000 index, which is the 2000 small cap companies, smaller companies, and remember that Donald Trump is doing all this in the name of boosting manufacturing, smaller, businesses in the US, right? The Russell 2000 index has gone up by just 1.76%, which is just less than 2%. So when the NASDAQ 100 is going at over 10 and a half, Russell 2000 is going at less than 2. That is the growth. So the story starts unraveling.
So the top companies, for example, might be doing really well, but when we account for the small companies and medium companies, they don't seem to be doing very well.
Exactly. And the broader story starts getting very nervy or muddied by the whole tariff story. The oldest index, I think, there is the Dow Jones Transport Index. Now, Transport Index would do well if the economy is buzzing. It should be doing very well. If, as Donald Trump says, trillions of dollars are coming and the American economy is really hot, then Transport Index should be doing well. It has actually declined since the start of the year by almost 2%, right? Another index which is not commonly talked about, but it is very crucial, is what happens to the S&P 500 Consumer Discretionary Index. Like when we do travel, tourism, that is a discretionary spend as against buying bread or eggs or butter, right?
Right. So basically the non-essential things.
Non-essentials. So they capture that aspect of the economy which tells you how well it is for a general consumer. And that number has also contracted by 0.36%. So, there are many ways in which you can look at the stock market data. And often we just go by the top companies, the top tech companies. And in fact, it is now said that US might be in a recession if you were to take away the tech companies, the growth of the tech companies.
And when it comes to the tech companies, is there growth related to AI?
So a lot of it is to do with AI. Companies like Nvidia are doing really well. And perhaps that story is not affected by tariffs as much because it's just such a remarkable area of growth right now globally. Every country in the world is on it. And so that growth may not be impacted, but the broader growth may be affected, and that may actually get worse. And, GDP growth rates for US have been halved over 2023 and 2024. The GDP in US, which is already the largest economy in the world, was around 2.9, 2.8% they were growing. Almost 3% every year they were growing. And US is a $30 trillion economy. So for it to grow at 3% is a massive thing. But for this year, it is 1.9% forecast. And for next year, it is 1.2% forecast. So, there is a very sharp deceleration in growth rate in US that is expected. So, yeah, the situation is getting worse as the months are progressing.
And the other thing, of course, that Donald Trump has been talking about is creating jobs, right? He wants to create American jobs. He wants to create jobs in small towns. But considering the fact that you're saying that a lot of these small and medium companies are not doing well, does that also mean that unemployment is also rising in the US?
So employment is coming under tremendous stress. Now, see the context that last year, or right through the last 2-3 years when US faced historically high inflation, the kind of inflation this last saw during Jimmy Carter's time, early 80s, they did not have a jobs problem. There were 2 jobs for every unemployed person in US in the last 2-3 years. That's the kind of hot economy US has been. And now in August, the Bureau of Labor Statistics revised some of the data starting May and June. They sharply cut down employment numbers, and so much so that it became an embarrassment for President Trump, and he fired the head of the Bureau of Labor Statistics, perhaps thinking that maybe the boss is tweaking the numbers, but that is not the case. Employment is taking a hit in the US. So those numbers are also now worsening, and it's actually now forcing the Federal Reserve, the central bank in US, which was not willing to cut rates because inflation was rising, is now giving Federal Reserve another rethink because now they're scared that if they do not cut interest rates, the employment situation may worsen. People may, not have jobs. So it's actually quite a sharp turnaround. It is just a period of 2-3 months where we are not seeing as much sharpness in the data. But by the year end, all of this will come together. And sadly, by that time, it would perhaps be a little too late.
And next, we revisit a major outbreak of communal violence leading up to the partition, On 16th August 1946, a year before India's independence, Calcutta witnessed 4 days of communal violence that later came to be remembered as the Great Calcutta Killings. The riots broke out after the Muslim League declared Direct Action Day to push for the creation of Pakistan. By the time order was restored, between 5,000 and 10,000 people had died, and around 15,000 were wounded. This was one of the single worst episodes of Hindu-Muslim violence leading up to the partition. Now, nearly 80 years later, filmmaker Vivek Agnihotri's upcoming movie Bengal Files has reignited debate over the portrayal of one of the key figures from the riots, Gopal Mukherjee, a portrayal which has now drawn protests from Mukherjee's family. To unpack this controversy and revisit the events leading up to the Direct Action Day, we are joined by the Indian Express's Adrija Roychowdhury. Adrija, could you start by talking about the events that led up to the Direct Action Day and why Calcutta became the epicenter of such violence?
So, see, basically, by March or early 1946 itself, the Muslim League was pretty much clear that the partition had to happen. And they had sort of committed themselves to accepting that nothing less than the partition and the creation of Pakistan is acceptable to them. So Muhammad Ali Jinnah was the leader of Muslim League at that time. He had in fact proclaimed this, that either there will be a divided India or there will be a destroyed India. That's a famous quote by him. So basically on 29th of July, the Muslim League, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, they gave a call to Muslims across India to observe 16th of August as Direct Action Day. What it meant was that, there will be strikes, hartals, protests, and to claim Pakistan. Now, this call was meant for all of India, of course, for Muslims across India, but nowhere else was it really taken very seriously. So if you see the media coverage of the time also, it did not get the kind of coverage as it would have been expected. In Bengal, though, things were a little different. So here, H.S. Sohrawardy, who was then the Prime Minister of Bengal, he said that, Direct Action Day, he declared it as a public holiday. So that, it made things very different in Bengal. Now, there is a lot of background to that as well. In Bengal, the Muslim population was fairly significant in terms of government service. So a year back when there were elections in Bengal and Sohrawardy came to power, in his entire cabinet, all except one, I believe, were all members of the Muslim League. So anyway, there was a lot of apprehension, a lot of fear among the Hindu population of Bengal because despite Calcutta being a majority Hindu city, in the overall state, the population of Muslims was in majority. And, the moment there was this call for Pakistan, it was fairly understood that large part of Bengal, which was dominated by Muslims, would go to East Pakistan. Now, when Sohrawardy declares Direct Action Day as a public holiday, that becomes an added source of fear for people of Calcutta. As of now, Calcutta was Hindu majority city. But if, again, because of Sohrawardy's governance over here, the fact that he had declared a public holiday on Direct Action Day, that made the Hindu population of Calcutta also very, very insecure and anxious about what is to happen. If at all, there were also anxieties about whether Calcutta would then become part of Pakistan.
Right, and as you mentioned, Bengal was a Muslim majority province, yet Calcutta largely had a Hindu population. So talk about how widespread was the violence and its impact in the city.
So because of the apprehension and anxiety that was already in the air, on the day of Direct Action Day, which is August 16th, there is unprecedented amount of violence that happens on the streets of Calcutta, which perhaps initially it did not happen anywhere else. It is in Calcutta that it started out. Of course, from there, it then spreads to large parts of Bihar as well. It goes on to Bombay. It goes to Noakhali, Garhmukteshwar. There are several parts of the country. But in Calcutta, it started out on August 16th, which was declared as a public holiday. So, of course, all the police had been taken off. They were not visible anywhere. The traffic police also had been withdrawn because of how this day was to be observed in the city. And right from the morning itself, you had news of, small sort of conflicts coming up. So you had reports of Hindus putting up barricades to stop Muslim processions. You had Muslims forcing Hindu shopkeepers to shut down their shops. And there was to be a large Muslim meeting at Maidan in central Calcutta, somewhere in the middle of the day, where Suhrawardi and this other Muslim League leader, Khwaja Nazimuddin, they were supposed to address the crowds. And about 1 lakh people are known to have attended this meeting. And although it remains debated exactly what was said in this meeting, but whatever was said by Suhrawardi, soon after, there was massive outbreak of violence in the city. You have reports of people just picking up anything and everything, like rod sticks, whatever guns, whatever came before them to sort of kill each other. And there was widespread communal violence over here.
And Adrija, we understand that a person named Gopal Mukherjee, also known as Gopal Patha, was at the center of this violence. So what do we know about him, and how did he rise to prominence in 1946?
So Gopal Mukherjee emerges over here as one of the characters, not a central character, but one of the few gang leaders who were part of this entire violence. So the thing is that, afterwards, in the decades that followed, a lot has been written about the Calcutta Killings. Now, one of the things that many historians have, or observers or journalists of the time had written, was that this was mainly a sort of a pogrom between two rival armies of the Calcutta underworld, divided between Muslims on the one hand and the Hindus and Sikhs on the other. And Gopal Mukherjee is one of these, underworld leaders. He's one of these gang leaders who emerges during this time. Historical accounts say that he had around 800 men under his command. And he went about, killing and hacking people on the streets of Calcutta. And much of what we know about Gopal Mukherjee is from two main sources. One is this book that was written in 1996 by Joyanto Ray and Suranjan Das. And the other is an interview that this British journalist, Andrew Whitehead of the BBC, he had carried out with Gopal Mukherjee in 1997. And parts of that interview also got published in Indian Express, where he actually spoke about what exactly he did during the riots of 1946.
Right. And you talked about the BBC interview earlier. Could you talk about, how Mukherjee himself described his role?
So in the interview to Andrew Whitehead that he had given in 1997, he had in very descriptive details, he had told exactly what he did on the day of August 16th. And he says that he was at his meat shop. I mean, his family owned a meat shop in central Calcutta and College Street, where he was sitting when he first saw members of the Muslim League marching up and down the streets with raising slogans like "Ladke Lenge Pakistan," which basically means that, we'll snatch and fight for Pakistan. And after that, he rounded up all his boys, these 800 boys apparently who were sort of under his command. He rounded them up and he gave them orders to protect the residents of this neighborhood. And then he went to his own residential area near Chandni Chowk in central Calcutta. And there also he then started getting more involved in the violence. He picked up a sword and he says that, he swiped at some person with the sword that he was carrying in his hand. He also made attempts to sort of stop the riots. In that interview, at least, he says that, he had some of his Muslim friends and who had been living in the same quarters. And he tells them that we've been living here as neighbors for several years, so we should not be rioting this way. But when he failed to stop the violence, that is when he decided to fight back. And in this interview in 97, he looks back and he says that, I realized that we had to save our country. Otherwise, this entire area would go to Pakistan and there would be more torture and bloodshed. So, and hence I did what I did. So he's in fact asked that, if he felt proud of what he did on August 16, 1946. And he says that, it's not about pride. It was really my duty, and it was my duty to help people in distress. So he firmly believed that, he was really protecting his community, his own people, during the riots of 46.
And Adrija, we are talking about this because of Vivek Agnihotri's upcoming film, Bengal Files. Now, the film, of course, is yet to be released. But just from the trailer, what sense do we get about how he has chosen to portray Gopal Mukherjee?
So basically this Gopal Mukherjee, he is being played by this actor called Saurav Das, and he's shown in a beard wearing long hair that has been piled on top of his head, which is apparently, the way Gopal Mukherjee looked as well, as per some of the historical documents that we have referred to. And he is seen, in front of the goddess Kali idol, and he is shown declaring that India is a nation for Hindus, and he blames Gandhi's non-violence movement for basically the victory of Jinnah.
भारत हिंदुओं का राष्ट्र है और इस युद्ध में हिंदू हार रहे हैं। जीत कौन रहा है? जिन्ना, क्योंकि हम सब नशे में चूर हैं और इस नशे का नाम है गांधी की अहिंसा।
And then he's shown going about in this hacking frenzy, killing people on the streets of Calcutta with his sword. So this is just a small snippet of what, the trailer shows us. And that's what we know as of now.
Right, and while writing about this incident, you also spoke with Mukherjee's grandson, who has spoken out against the trailer of the film. So tell us, what is he claiming about Mukherjee's role in the violence?
So his grandson claims that the way this movie by Vivek Agnihotri that has depicted Gopal Mukherjee, that is very offensive, because he believes that, yes, he went about in a killing spree, and he was, he definitely indulged in a lot of violence during the Calcutta Killings, but also it was not as vulgar as the way Vivek Agnihotri has portrayed him. And he claims that, nobody from the family was consulted when the movie was being made. And his grandson claims that Gopal Mukherjee was a follower of Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose, and he was very much a part of the revolutionary movement that was in Bengal in the early decades of the 20th century. He was part of this group called the Atma Unnati Samiti, which was one of the revolutionary nationalist groups in Bengal, like Anushilan Samiti and Jugantar, about which we have read. This was one another group, and he was attached to them as well. And supposedly he had taken part in the Quit India movement as well. And then soon after the Quit India movement of 1943, there was a little bit of a difference of opinion with the other nationalist leaders. And that is why he stopped. And the next time he took on this, revolutionary character was during the 1946 riots. So that is somewhat what his background is like.
And in the end, we take a look at the Supreme Court's order demanding an unconditional apology from comedian Samay Raina. Yesterday, the Apex Court directed Raina and 4 others to issue an unconditional public apology for ridiculing persons with disabilities and rare genetic disorders in their shows and podcasts. The bench, comprising Justices Suryakant and Joymal Labakchi, stated that the degree of repentance should exceed the degree of the offense. The case was filed by SMA Cure Foundation, which accused the comedians of making derogatory remarks against persons with disabilities. The foundation argued that such humor denigrates individuals with disabilities, perpetuates harmful stereotypes, and undermines their dignity and fundamental rights. Alongside Raina, comedians Vipin Goyal, Balraj Paramjeet Singh Ghai, Sonali Thakkar, and Nishant Jagdish Tanwar were also named in the proceedings. The court indicated that the quantum of penalty would be decided at the next hearing. It also noted that provisions under the Information Technology Act could allow penal consequences for such actions. The court instructed the comedians to display their apologies to the same platforms where the content was circulated, such as podcasts and social media channels. Justice Bagchi observed that while humor is a part of life, using it to mock others, especially marginalized communities, creates a breach of sensibility at the societal level. He added that social media influencers should recognize that they are commercializing speech which carries responsibilities beyond personal expression. Earlier in February, after YouTuber Ranveer Allahabadiya, better known for his channel Bare Biceps, got into legal trouble over an alleged obscene remark on Raina's India's Got Latent YouTube show, the court had asked the centre for its views on regulating digital content while safeguarding the right to free speech. You were listening to Three Things by the Indian Express. Today's show was edited and mixed by Suresh Pawar and produced by Shashank, Bhargava and me, Ichha Sharma. If you like the show, do subscribe to us wherever you get your podcast. You can also recommend it to someone you think may like it, with a friend or in your family. This is the best way for people to get to know about us. You can also tweet us at Express Podcast or write to us at podcast@indianexpress.com.